I'm Dottie Fulginetti, and I work with the Old Colony Planning Council as the Economic Recovery Planner and also Chair of the Select Board in Easton. As you may have noticed, the format of this meeting is a webinar versus a regular meeting. We've switched to a webinar format to ensure security of the meeting from Zoom bombers. This requires an additional step to register, but it gives us more control of the meeting. We appreciate your patience. As a housekeeping issue, we ask that you remain on mute until recognized to speak. If you have a question, please indicate that on the Q&A and we'll call on you. You may also type a question into the chat. We will take questions at the end of Dr. Melnick's presentation. The formal part of the meeting will end at 1 p.m., but we'll keep the Zoom window open for another 15 minutes in case people want to chat and network. I'll read the accessibility statement before we go on. The Old Colony CEDs Committee fully complies with Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and related statutes and regulations in all programs and activities. The Old Colony CEDs Committee operates without regard to race, color, or national origin, including limited English proficiency, age, sex, disability, ancestry, ethnicity, gender identity or expression, sexual orientation, religion, creed, veteran status, or background. Any person who believes that they or any specific class of persons to be subject to discrimination prohibited by Title VI may by themselves or by a representative file a written complaint with the Old Colony CEDs. Complaints are to be filed no later than 180 days from the date of the alleged discrimination. This meeting is accessible to people with disabilities and all those with limited English proficiency. Accessibility accommodations and language services will be provided free of charge upon request as available. Please contact Mary Waldron at 508-583-1833, extension 202 for more information. I'll turn it back to you, John, if you want to request a vote on the minutes of September 15th, and then I'll pick it back up again.
Great, thank you, Dottie. So as Dottie mentioned, the minutes from the September meeting had gone out. Hopefully people have had an opportunity to review those. At this time, we'd like to entertain a motion to approve those minutes.
And please unmute yourself to make a motion to approve in second.
I'll make the motion. There's no one else is standing up. Yeah.
And I will second that motion.
Great, thank you. All those in favor?
And you can raise your hand in the box or unmute yourself, either way.
I saw some hands raised.
Okay,
Great, thank you.
terrific.
So Dottie, I'll turn it over to you to introduce my colleague. This worked out well that Mark and I worked together with the Donahue Institute, so we're excited to have him here today. But if you want to provide a little background.
Sure. Well, we're delighted to be joined by Dr. Mark Melnick, Director of Economic and Public Policy Research from the UMass Donahue Institute. Dr. Melnick specializes in demographic, socioeconomic, and labor market issues and leads a 15-person team working on a variety of economic and public policy research projects, informing clients in government, private industry, and the nonprofit sectors. In his time at the Institute, Dr. Melnick has served as the principal in charge on projects with such clients as the Secretary of the Commonwealth, the Massachusetts Gaming Commission, the Boston Foundation, the City of Boston, the City of Cambridge, Mass DOT, the New England Foundation for the Arts, Mass Econ, Mass Development, and Boston Private Industry Council, the Massachusetts Department of Housing and Community Development, the Massachusetts Housing Partnership, and the Metro South Chamber of Commerce. So we welcome Dr. Melnick and thank you for joining us today. You can share your screen also if you are ready to do that.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Dottie, and thanks everybody. And John for the little bit of a warm up. John gets to hear me talk too much, so for the rest of you, you haven't. I recognize a number of you guys, but it's great to be invited to speak to you all today, and really do. You know, I think of these a lot as information sharing and opportunities for me to hear more about what folks are experiencing around the state, as much as it is for me to present on some of the things that have been taking place in the state economy. As Dottie described, I direct economic and public policy research at the Donahue Institute. We operate as a kind of economic consulting organization out of the UMass system. And part of that is working with a variety of clients, as Dottie outlined before, city government, municipal government, nonprofits and such, to talk about all manners of economic, workforce, and other kinds of public policy issues that come up. Part of that is the production of mass benchmarks, which comes out a couple times a year, that takes academic research and kind of repackages it in a public policy context. And it's that effort in that work in mass benchmarks that really has given rise or provides the background for what I affectionately refer to amongst our team as the road show, or where I end up giving talks around the state about different issues as they relate to the broad economy in Massachusetts. One of the funny things, though, was about this time last year, in January of last year, the road show had been so tested, and we'd been doing it for effectively the same for a couple of years, that I was like, well, this is kind of boring. The economy's been strong, and population's been growing, and I could kind of do it in my sleep. And then obviously the world changed dramatically in March. So be careful what you wish for in some ways about having something new to talk about. So the presentation I'm going to do today is going to highlight host disabled attendee screen sharing. So whoever's hosting, if you can help me out on that, I would just want to hit screen sharing. It's not available to me. But in today's presentation, what I'm going to do is, okay, great. Talk about where the mass economy was before COVID, where the mass economy was before COVID-19, what were some of the key characteristics that we were seeing in Massachusetts in general. And I think it's an important way of contextualizing the amount of fall that we saw from the perch that the state economy was at the beginning of the calendar year. And what we saw generally was this was an economy that was performing quite well, although that experience wasn't evenly felt geographically or demographically in the state. I'll then pivot and talk a bit about COVID-19 and what it's done to the economy overall, and then talk about the Old Colony area a bit and what we're seeing in its local economy, and then where the state is positioned. Happy to field questions. This roadshow that I've been doing specifically on COVID is really varied from a 15-minute talk to a 45-minute talk. So there's a lot of things that have been left on the cutting room floor, but I'd be more than happy to discuss with you guys during the Q&A. So first, what was the state of the Massachusetts economy before the COVID outbreak? This first graphic that I share looks at population growth in Massachusetts compared to the other northeastern states in the US overall between 2010 and 2019. Massachusetts was stood out as a leader in the Northeast in terms of population growth over that period. We lagged slightly behind the US. Over that period, the US grew 6.3%, Mass grew 5.3%. All other Northeastern states were lagging behind that, including Connecticut and Vermont actually losing population during that time period. Throughout the US, and there's another version of this graphic that I'll show, which is actually a map of the whole US, we will see that there's been significant population gains in the Southwest and the southeastern parts of the US. People discovering that winter here is brutal and might just maybe live somewhere else. But even with that said, Massachusetts has been a significant gainer in population over the last decade. This next graphic shows the importance of immigration to our general population growth statewide. We see three different lines here that show the different elements of population change. The red shows the net gain in international migrants in Massachusetts between 2000 and 2019. The gray shows the natural increase or the difference between birth and death. And the blue shows domestic migration, or the net difference between people coming to Massachusetts from somewhere in the US versus going elsewhere. So let me break these apart. First, on natural increase, we're generally gaining a little bit. We're having more births than deaths in Massachusetts. but it's been decreasing. Part of it is because Massachusetts is an older state, and most of New England has been experiencing this, and that been a slow decline in our natural increase. There's some New England states, Maine in particular, which has actually seen this flip, where there's actually been more deaths than births, so the natural increase has actually been a decrease. But in Massachusetts, we've been flat and consistent, though it's been going down. Part of it is the age of the state. Another factor in this is the well-educated female population in Massachusetts with high labor force participation rates. So that tends to translate into delayed family starts and smaller family sizes. So in general, it's a gain in natural increase, but not a huge driver of our population. We see a net decrease in domestic migration. In fact, historically, Massachusetts has been a net loser in people going to other states. The only time in recent history where we were a net gainer was during the Great Recession, where the economy had stalled for a very long period of time and people were less able to move, less mobile. So we saw more people staying in the state versus migrating out. So the big driver is the gain in international migration. In fact, between 2000 and 2019, Massachusetts would have actually lost population if it were not for the gain in foreign-born residents. The foreign-born population in Massachusetts has accounted for 80% of the labor force growth since 1990. So this is a huge factor in what sustains our economy and was been driving our population growth over the last couple of decades. Although interestingly, we do see dating somewhere in between 2016 and 2017, a decrease in our international migrants. And obviously there's been a slowdown in the COVID period with mobility and people coming from other countries. Our next graphic looks at job growth in the Northeast and Massachusetts over the same time period. Similar to population growth, the state has also been a leader in job growth over the decade, with growing about nearly 15% jobs between 2010 and 2019. This is similar to the US, which is just a hair under 16%. We're in line with New York and ahead of all other Northeastern states. Part of what's driven economic growth and population growth in Massachusetts has been our mix of knowledge-based industries. This graphic here shows on the left the percent of Massachusetts jobs in each of the two-digit sectors, NAICS sectors in the economy. On the right, we see the US. So big leaders for Massachusetts in particular, and I think you'd see my arrow when I do this, but healthcare and social assistance, which has been particularly important for Mass for a long time, is also a leader in the old colony district. Educational services and our concentration of world-class universities have always been an important driver of job growth in the state. And then a critically important one that is not named particularly well is professional, scientific, and technical services. This is an industry that includes a lot of high tech, bio, and other kinds of knowledge industries that have been a driver for some of the cutting edge industries that have been growing in the state over the last couple of decades. And Mass makes up almost 10% of our jobs compared to just 6.5% nationwide. Another important industry that's really been hurt in this recession, and I'll highlight later, is our accommodation and food services, which is somewhat in line with the US in general in terms of its size in the economy, but 9% of all jobs in Massachusetts are in accommodation and food, and these were industries that were hit particularly hard during the COVID outbreak. So while the states performed well, these impacts have not been felt evenly. This next graphic I show is the state population growth between 2010 and 2019, and disentangling Greater Boston from the rest of the state. What we found, particularly in this decade, is that Greater Boston its primacy has grown in terms of being an economic and population center of Massachusetts. Now, while Greater Boston's always been the biggest part of the state, It's really become much more important in recent years. One of the interesting tidbits between 2000 and in 2010, Greater Boston made up about 45% of the state. And between 2000 and 2010, it accounted for about 45% of the population growth. So there was this kind of even way in which the state was growing over that decade. Fast forward to today, Greater Boston still makes up about 45, 46% of the state's total population, but it accounted for 67% of the population growth over that same decade. And for in a pre-pandemic, most of us, whoever drove into Boston during the day, experienced or tried to drive out around 3:30, 4 or 5, experienced just incredible traffic and the cost of housing and all the things about the concentration of population and jobs in that area. But when you disentangle, you see that Greater Boston was such a huge driver of population growth for the state overall. For the Old Colony Planning District area, the population has been growing not as robust as Greater Boston, but more significantly than the state. And we would see in some other graphics that we actually were seeing some population decline in the West, or very flat population growth in parts of the West and the Southeast. And some of that's because of these older districts with median ages that were significantly higher than Greater Boston and not the same kind of concentration of jobs in the knowledge economy. Highlighting a similar trend is how jobs have grown around the state. Between 2000 and 2018, the state grew 14% more jobs. This graphic shows each county in Massachusetts and how much they had grown over the same time period. And as we see in central and eastern part of Massachusetts, more significant job growth than, say, the West or the Southeast. In a longer presentation, I would also highlight, and I'll touch on a little bit later, that demographically we did not see the same positive experiences in the economy as well, as while the state economy had been growing significantly over the decade. We're seeing significant differences in terms of the experiences for people with limited educational attainment and also by race. So how has COVID impacted the state economy? Well, this next graphic that we're showing here shows the unemployment rate in Massachusetts and the US dating back to 1976. The red line being the US and the blue being Massachusetts. Historically, and each of the gray bars that we see running vertically in the graphic are the recessions over the time period. And the thickness of the bar indicates how long the recession took place. But over time, what we've seen is that for the most part, the Massachusetts economy has trended pretty closely with the US and has generally performed better in terms of unemployment. The last time that the Massachusetts unemployment rate trended above the US unemployment rate was really in the early 90s. We had some significant impacts of recession over time that have maybe were felt differently in Mass than other places. For example, the dot-com bust in Massachusetts in the early, in 2000, 2001, 2002 was maybe more significantly felt here, even though the unemployment rate was a little bit lower still than the US. It brought our unemployment rate closer to the US. And we were trending almost exactly with the US up until the Great Recession. And then in the Great Recession is when we see this departure point between the Massachusetts economy and the US economy. Part of this, again, is the mix of industries that we highlighted before. Industries that really got hit hard during the Great Recession, manufacturing and retail in particular. While they exist in Massachusetts, they're not the same size in the state. Our manufacturing sector in Massachusetts looks very different than the US one because we have a lot of highly productive, capital intensive types of manufacturing in drug manufacturing, things related to military industries and such that did not suffer the same kind of downturn as other parts of the US. But through the period after the Great Recession till COVID, our unemployment rate tended to be quite a bit lower than the US. Then you get into March and the unemployment rate shoots up dramatically. When I was giving this presentation in June, it was interesting because the shot up of the line was the end of the graph. So you have to actually point out to people that this is not the end of the graph, but rather this dramatic increase. Now, through much of the summer, Massachusetts had the highest unemployment rate in the US, including peaking somewhere around 16.2%. Over the last few months, our unemployment rate has gone down. Mass is about 9.6% right now, the US at about 8%. Well, and we no longer have the highest unemployment rate in the country. Why does Mass have one of the highest? Well, the COVID impacts were felt here earlier in the Northeast than other parts of the US. So states like Massachusetts and New York were particularly damaged in the early periods of COVID. We've also taken a much more conservative approach in terms of reopening the state, which has slowed some of the economic recovery. We have seen in recent months that jobs have grown in the state. We've also seen that labor force participation and folks dropping out of the labor force have gone up. So that has also helped bring the unemployment rate down. So that is obviously a concern still. But the unemployment rate has trended below 10% finally, which is at least a good sign. But there are a lot of concerns on the horizon as we move ahead. This next graphic shows the initial unemployment claims, and they've vastly exceeded those of the Great Recession and all previous recessions. The peak was in March, where we saw initial claims hit its high in a week of 181,000 claims in 1 week. Comparatively, at the peak of the Great Recession, we were seeing claims that were in the mid 20s, approaching 30,000s. And that's how many we had last week in this COVID period. So what we're experiencing now in terms of just the shock to the market has been so dramatic and unlike anything we've ever seen before, including the Great Recession from 12 years ago. And after a long period of expansion, the COVID-19 recession has wiped out all the job gains that the state experienced since the Great Recession. And we're just kind of coming back to that point as we look at the graphic here. The drop off in the green in March, and then kind of coming back up now for the data points that we have for September. And it's trending pretty close to where the bottom was for the Great Recession. So who's been impacted, or what industries have been impacted? The hardest hit sectors since the peak of the recovery were accommodation, food services, healthcare, arts and entertainment, and the unfortunately named other services. So what we see here is the amount of jobs that are lost in each one of these sectors between February 2020 and September 2020. Accommodation and food services lost 35% of their jobs over that time period. The good news is that this number was around 50% a couple of months ago. So we've seen a slow recovery of some of these opportunities. Healthcare has seen a decline. Arts, entertainment, and recreation, obviously a significant decline, almost half of those jobs. And then other services, which includes a lot of things like direct personal services. So this could include dry cleaning, hair salons, barbershops, nail salons, massage therapy, those kinds of things. So what is natural that we've seen in this and makes sense is that economic activity that is face-to-face and require personal interaction with somebody, those are all industries that were hurt dramatically during this downturn. Every industry in the state has experienced some level of downturn or some level of job loss since February. But you see some industries like professional and technical services losing just 1.5% of their total jobs. Well, these are jobs that are very easy to do from home compared to, say, things like going to restaurants or other forms of arts and entertainment, which require face-to-face interaction and are obviously not anywhere close to being back to fully operational. The unemployment that we've seen in the state has exacerbated existing elements of social inequality that we had already seen. This graphic here shows the current unemployment rate by educational attainment in Massachusetts. The purple line is less than high school. green, high school diploma or GED, yellow, some college, and gray, bachelor's degree or higher. And right before the recession, we would see unemployment rates for folks with a college degree that were just around 2%. When the COVID outbreak ramped up, we saw unemployment rates increase dramatically. In April of 2020, folks with less than a high school diploma had an unemployment rate of 39%. Folks with a high school diploma, 25%. Some college, 23.5%, and a bachelor's degree, 9.2%. Those rates have gone down, but still dramatically higher for folks with limited educational attainment. With less than high school, it's around 19%. High school diploma, 10.6%. Some college, 9%. And folks with a bachelor's degree have an unemployment rate of just about 5% right now. So not surprising when we see which industries lost a lot of jobs, but it just highlights again that the populations who have been affected by this pandemic tend to be folks with limited educational attainment, tended to be younger, and tend to be communities of color. Similarly, on this next graphic, we show the unemployment rate for the white non-Hispanic population and communities of color in the state right now. And we see that for people of color, the unemployment rate around 11% compared to folks who are white, around 6%. So what about the Old Colony district? So this next graphic shows the mix of industries in Old Colony compared to Massachusetts and what industries stand out for OCPC. Not surprisingly for this group, you guys would know your industries well. Healthcare and social assistance is the largest industry in the region, but other critically important ones, retail, 16.2% compared to just 10% for the state. So retail is huge in this region. Accommodation Food Services, 10.4% compared to 8.7%. Construction, 8.3% compared to 4.7%. So these are drivers of the OCPC region. And the parts of OCPC that look different than Massachusetts tie back to the professional, scientific, and technical services. Only about 3.3% of the region is in that sector compared to 9.2% for Massachusetts. So what I think is really important for highlighting when we think about Old Colony is that some of its concentrations of industries are precisely those that have been ones that were hurt badly during the economic downturn and are industries that require a high level of face-to-face contact. I noted, I just buzzed right past other services, but this is another one where 5.1% of OCPC is the other services again, and those are a lot of personal care sectors compared to 3.4 in Mass. So again, face-to-face industries are really important to the region. Unemployment rate in OCPC compared to the state. Before the downturn, the region had about a 3% unemployment rate, which was right in line with the state, which was around 2.8. But now unemployment in the region is about a percentage point higher than the state. And the reason, again, kind of ties back to the mix of industries that are critical here. Some cities in particular, or municipalities have gotten hit worse than others, of course. Brockton, for example, had an unemployment rate of 4% before the downturn, and its August 2020 number was at 17.3%. Avon had an unemployment rate of 2.8% in August of 2019, and it was up to 12.6% this most recent summer. Stoughton, 3% last year, and about 12% now. So some of the municipalities that have been really whacked hard during the downturn. One of the things I took out of this presentation because of limited time was also the spread of positive infection rate around the state. And while I highlight Brockton's high unemployment rate, Brockton is also one of the most impacted communities in terms of COVID infection in the state. Trailing only behind Chelsea and Lawrence. And one of the critical determinants of that we found in some of our research has been overcrowded housing. So we see, again, the ways in which COVID is really impacting lower income folks. This is this is a new concept we just put together for this presentation, and I think it's pretty cool. What we're showing here is that the OCPC region has been hit harder with unemployment claims when we compare it to the state total claims in the labor force in general. So the squiggly line, orange line, shows the percent of OCPC claims of all Massachusetts unemployment claims. And then relative to OCPC's percent of the mass labor force. So the elements where the orange is above the straight gray line shows where the claims in the region are higher than its share of the labor force in the state. So there is a disproportionate amount of claims relative to the size of the labor force in the region. And then the blues just show the amount of initial unemployment claims. So we're seeing here that overall throughout the pandemic, for the most part, OCPC is seeing a higher proportion of folks filing for initial unemployment claims than its own share within the state's workforce. So it's just another way of expressing some of the concepts I've been saying earlier, that this is a region that has been uniquely hit. While everywhere has been hit, the mix of industries in here, because of its concentration in service sectors, has meant that the population in this region has been impacted greatly in terms of job loss. And similarly, sectors that typically cannot accommodate remote work were hit hardest in the pandemic. The gray bars that we're seeing, or the blue bars, I should say, should look somewhat similar. This is the distribution of employment in OCPC by major industry sector. And then the gray above it are the percent of all claims by industry sector in OCPC. So, so what are the ones that are worth noting? Accommodation and food services, they make up 10% of all jobs in the region, but also makes up 15% of all unemployment claims in the region. Construction makes up 8.3% of all jobs in the region, but makes up 10% of the unemployment claims. And I'll find other services here, 5% of all the jobs in the region, but make up 7.3% of all the unemployment claims. So just highlighting that, again, we see unemployment claims across the industry, across the entire economy, but certain industries are obviously disproportionately represented in those claims. So what do the workers who have filed for unemployment insurance look like in the Old Colony Planning District? What we're looking at, I'll bring them all up. What we're looking at here is what claimants look like during the pandemic versus before the pandemic. First off, we're seeing a lot more women are being impacted by the economic downturn than men. In OCPC, about 2/3 of claimants traditionally were men for unemployment insurance, but now we're seeing it's a little bit more women. 17% of claimants had less than a bachelor's degree. 23% of the claimants being non-white, with about 6% Hispanic or Latinx. In other versions of this presentation, I would include age, and we see the age profile of folks who have been applying for unemployment insurance are dramatically on the younger side of the scale, with about 50% of claimants being 34 years of age or younger. And a lot of these folks earning less than $600 a week, so tend to be on the lower end of the income scale. And then what are some of the hardest hit sectors in the region in terms of job loss? And this kind of highlights some of the things we've already been saying, but education and health services decreased 11.5% between February and September. Other services, personal services, about 25% over that period. Governments lost about 1,000 jobs, or 6% over that period. Leisure and hospitality decreased 8.6%. information in this, which is a smaller industry, also decreased about 17%. But for the most part, we're seeing this concentration again in more of the service sectors of the economy. Okay, so time was a bit limited, and I want to leave room for questions and answers, but I wanted to talk about some of the things going forward. So what are the big question marks in the economy, and what should we be concerned about? First and foremost is the condition of state and local budgets for fiscal 21 and beyond. We still don't have a state budget for fiscal 21, although we're getting closer. You know, and as anyone who would be a part of this presentation would be familiar, you know, the demand on state services always go up during economic downturns, but where most state budgets are required to be balanced, we know that the receipts go down, the intake of revenues go down for the state during down economic times, but the needs for the population go up. And so we have a lot of significant concerns there. And then obviously the other resources that local communities need in terms of, you know, running public schools or whatever, and making sure that those are safe places. So the condition of local budgets and the resources available are first and foremost a concern going ahead. The next is the state eviction moratorium, which was just lifted on Saturday, and what this means for housing and housing affordability in general. The entire eviction story is a difficult one. Obviously, we have a high cost state. The amount of housing burden for renters in Massachusetts has gone up over the decade. Even as the economy improved, we saw that, you know, for homeowners who tend to be higher income, the percentage of their income that was going to housing was actually going down since 2010. But for renters, it had been going up. So this was a population that was already stretched thin. And then when you introduce an economic downturn of this level, what does this mean for their ability to pay rent? Separately, though, every person's rent is somebody else's income. And so we have a lot of disruptions or instability in the housing market that we can anticipate going ahead, especially if we don't see any significant federal stimulus in the upcoming year, or another wave of the virus as we get into cold and flu season. When I first wrote this slide a month or so ago, it was expiration of unemployment stimulus. That actually, you know, there was the expiration where the $600 was taken away, but then more money, but $300 was put on. But we did see almost immediately changes in spending in the economy overall, as folks who are unemployed had less money to spend and help stimulate the economy. So that is something worth tracking. You know, which industries are poised to recover, which ones will continue to struggle. You know, we've highlighted already, or I highlighted already early in this presentation about the industries that have been impacted by the economic downturn, specifically leisure and hospitality and food services. Some of these places are opening back up, of course, but they're operating at lower capacity. When will they be able to operate at a higher capacity as we enter the winter? Our restaurants aren't able to stay open for outdoor dining. What's that going to mean for that industry going ahead? And of course, the psychology of spending. You know, I still haven't eaten a meal inside since the pandemic. I've only gone and eaten outside a couple of times. You know, just by opening stuff doesn't naturally mean that people are going to start doing the things that they were doing before. So the psychological comfort with gathering in spaces is going to be important in helping understand when a full recovery is possible in the economy overall. And then lastly, the existing public policy and infrastructure issues that exist in the state, they're still there. We had a lot of concerns about traffic before this, and maybe we're going to see different kinds of mobility of labor post the pandemic, which I'm sure will be maybe a question later. But, you know, issues of traffic, internet access, cost of housing, all these things were huge challenges for Massachusetts before. And then I think as we, in the coming year or two, as COVID-19 enters the rear view for us, hopefully, there are a host of other challenges that we're sitting there that we'll need to re-engage with. So with that, I'll stop my presentation and happy to take any questions from folks. And there's some here that I can come back to. So thank you.
Great.
So the first question I see, and then from Mary, and then I don't know if Dottie, do you want to let people are going to unmute? Is that how you want to handle things?
Sure. If somebody wants to speak, just put a note in there and unmute themselves.
All right, let me deal with Mary's first. She had, Mark, we might need to come back to discuss question marks, housing eviction, when the vaccine is developed and approved, and what will be the impact to industries come to the region as a deeper dive, perhaps sometime in February. Yeah. I think coming back later would be excellent. I'd be happy to do it. And we actually do a study group with my own team where we kind of, it was interesting because when this all first started, it was tough because everyone knew the economy was falling apart, but there was no data, because there's always a natural lag in your employment data, your unemployment data, who's been impacted. So a lot of it was based on feel or using novel data concepts to try to capture, okay, so what is happening here? So as a result, we've been doing a lot of, internal study group of what are we seeing here? What are we seeing there? What kind of unique data could be informing this or that? So I would definitely be happy to come back and talk more about this, especially as we know more. It's definitely been an interesting exercise. There's more ambiguity about what the future holds more than any other time when I've been asked to come and speak to groups like this. But it's exciting in the sense that there's no analog. So there's a way of just kind of engaging in this in a way that we've never really had to before.
Great. Elijah has a question. Elijah, if you want to unmute and ask your question. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity and the presentation. So I just wanted to ask, I guess, as you have been looking at these trends as it relates to affordable housing, could you comment on maybe whether or not this pandemic has shown a further need for affordable housing or not?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things, and it's tough, I'm going to exit my screen here, but if we need to throw slides up again, I'll throw them back up there. One of the things that I thought was super interesting that kind of came out of this crisis was the way in which COVID-19 was a great revealer of existing social inequalities in our society already. And most crises have that characteristic to it. But in this one in particular, we did a really cool analysis a couple months back, and it's on our website. It's called the Donahue Data Dash, where we wanted to take existing data around the COVID issue without having done a deep analysis of it. We saw positive testing rates in different communities. And the ones that what we saw in the positive testing rates was if you just ranked them, it was all gateway cities. It was Chelsea, it was Lawrence, it was Brockton, it was Holyoke, it was Springfield, it was New Bedford. And as we were looking at it, I said, it'd be really interesting is to take census data, American Community Survey data, and plot against the COVID positive testing rates that we're seeing, some of the other social characteristics we see in communities to see what kind of trends that we find. Some of which were pretty instinctive because of what you would know about these communities. Municipalities with high concentration of people of color had much more incidence of COVID-19. Similar communities that had a lot of frontline workers. But then on affordable housing, one of the most interesting elements for us was that communities with high concentrations of overcrowded housing, that was having more than one person on average per room in their home, that was the most highly correlated variable to the positive COVID testing rate among all the variables that we compared. Nobody lives in overcrowded housing by choice, or more importantly, people live in overcrowded housing for economic reasons. They do it because of issues of affordability. that this is what your family can afford, and we're going to double up or triple up in this apartment. This it's natural to see how that has led to an increase of COVID-19 in different communities, because if 7 people are living in a 2-bedroom apartment with 1 bathroom, the ability to quarantine yourself at home is non-existent. So versus saying folks that live in, say, the suburbs and they have multiple bathrooms and whatever. So, you know, to your question of what does this say about affordable housing, you know, it says that the more affordable housing that we have available for people in the region, the less people will have to overcrowd in the housing that they are in. There will always be a density story about this. It's an infectious disease. So where people gather and where people live in highly dense areas, we also saw increases in COVID. But it wasn't as simple as saying cities get it and rural areas don't. Because what it really was is low income cities got it because people were living in crowded housing. And the reason people live in crowded housing is because they can't afford the housing in the region that they're in. So, you know, so it's interesting because on the surface, it might not appear to be an affordable housing issue. But when you dig into it, it does highlight again just the ways in which, the socioeconomics are such a critical factor in life chances in public health in general.
Thank you.
So Stephanie had to leave, but she asked if there's any insight on the long-term impact of this downturn on certain industries that by their very nature operate on a high cost, low return model, even in normal times, such as restaurants.
Right. I don't have any research on my fingertips on this, but there has been a lot of discussion about this because off of Stephanie's example, there's a lot of concern in the restaurant industry as we walk into the winter. We lost a huge period of time this year for revenues for these restaurants, and the margins were already thin to begin with. Now you have a period where you're able to make money again, but you're walking headlong into a time when where it's winter time, eating outside is not going to be an option for folks. So I think the amount of closures that we may see in the restaurant industry is deeply concerning. I live in Natick now, but was living in Boston for years before this, and the number of favorite restaurants in Boston that I've already seen closing has been disappointing. I think every region of the state can point to this. So I think there's been a lot of conversation about this, but a lot of ambiguity or at least lack of clarity about when this ends. But I do think it'll be interesting to see after the election and what resources may or may not be made available for different kinds of small businesses in stimulus, because this is a sector that is really in a lot of ways the cultural lifeblood of a lot of areas, but is deeply vulnerable by the time of the year that we're walking into, and then obviously the thin margins that they were already operating with in the first place. The second part of it too is some of it's the margins, but some of it's the business concept, right? You have some restaurants where they're open all week, but they really only make money on Saturday and Sunday morning for brunch, right? But they always relied on high capacity, fast turnover that you can't really do it the same way right now. So there's a lot of risks for this industry that's deeply concerning.
Thanks. John Murray has a comment.
Thanks, Dottie. One thing, Mark, that I found interesting that we've noticed with our job seekers is the effect that childcare is having with people being home with children, with schools being remote. So it's really limiting not only somebody's ability to conduct a job search, but also their availability of when they could work.
Right.
So, we see the UI claims of sky high, and sort of tried to gear up to help those people with a job search. But particularly with DTA customers who is mostly single parents, they really can't be on a job search because they're trying to homeschool children. So the ripple effects of schools, being remote and I know there's many people struggling with that. But in a two-parent household where you can sort of work with your partner and say, you take this, I'll take that, as opposed to a single parent, it's really exacerbated the problem.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And one of my favorite colleagues who does similar work to us, Alicia Sasser-Montestino over at Northeastern, has done a bunch of work about the gendered element of this, right? Where the number of women who are maybe dropping out of the workforce because of the childcare needs. And I think that's also probably a bit of a factor why we see the unemployment claims for women being higher than for men is some of the responsibilities at home. I live this, John, as you know, I have a 7-year-old daughter and a 4-year-old daughter. And so my wife and I both were able to work remote. So we spent all summer, it was spring and summer, dueling, with taking care of the kids. And then brought my sister in as a nanny for the fall, just because, but we could do it, right? And then there are some families that can't, or the kind of work that they do doesn't really match for it. So it's a huge problem for families, and one that again hits close to home for me because we've been surviving and able to work, and it felt unsustainable to us just from an anecdotal perspective of just how hard it is to be a parent in this situation. But every time that we complain about it, I say to my wife, it's like, we're healthy and working, and so how many other people that aren't able to do that. So it's really tough. And childcare is already so expensive to begin with. We have one of the highest childcare costs in the country.
And the private child care providers really weren't getting any kind of assistance from the government. We had someone in our town that has a private daycare and saying it's really not fair that there was no subsidies for some of the private daycares just on a policy perspective from Massachusetts. So even within certain industry segments, it seems like there's not necessarily an equity among how people are even getting their aid.
Right.
The next question is from Becky Coletta. Are restaurants more able to survive in the suburbs based on takeout versus in cities where they're dependent on business activity?
It's a good theory, Becky. I'm not sure, to be honest. What we do know is that your big corporate food, restaurants and such have done okay during the pandemic. They're less likely to close down. So those are also locations that are more likely to be in the suburbs than say the city. You think about, I haven't been downtown. My office was in downtown Boston. I haven't been downtown in 7 months, thinking about all those delis that would have relied on, the foot traffic every single day. So you could see where those risks are. I think what you're suggesting about takeout makes sense, but I don't know of any data one way or the other to say if that's true.
Old Colony Planning Council put together a business guide with some ideas and tips for different businesses on things they could think about, from taking another look at their finances, or even with restaurants, like you pointed out, if they take a look at their their peak times, does it make sense to stay open all week if really the primary part of your business is in 2 days? Or, if you have an extensive menu, does it make sense to see what are your top sellers and try to limit that? I know in Florida, when they got closed down and then they opened back up relatively quickly. So when they close down, they lose all that food, all that money that was invested in that food, even a lot of the alcohol. So they go make that reinvestment to open back up, only to be shut down again. So also keeping track of, how much inventory do you need to have on hand, or what's the right amount? Because if it does get shut down again, you might be able to withstand it once if that happens. But if it happens twice, how resilient are you moving forward? And I think that's one of the things that we try to talk about with our business community is it's one thing to recover from COVID, but also looking and evaluating how do you look to be resilient to withstand future shocks in the economy.
Okay. That's a great point, Dottie.
Other questions? We have about 5 minutes left for Dr. Melnick.
Lee Hartman from Plymouth. I have one question. I know this has been more oriented towards economics and businesses, but we're seeing in Plymouth just an unending appetite for sale of homes down here. Have you started to see, I haven't heard much about where these people are coming from and whether or not we're starting to notice a migration from urban areas to, I always say, what people perceive as safer areas.
Yeah. So we haven't done a lot of research on that yet ourselves, but there is anecdotally, and I guess there are data that are aligning with this idea that people from urban areas have been drawn to less dense locations recently. So I listened to a story on NPR recently, or WBUR in Boston, on the Berkshires and this kind of increase of folks from New York and Connecticut and from the eastern part of Massachusetts, and seeing what it's doing to home prices there and inventory there. Similarly, there was a story this morning on WBUR about sales in the Cape and how they've gone up dramatically. So I have been honestly floored by the residential sales market in Massachusetts over the last 8 months. Like, I cannot believe that we haven't seen any kind of slowdown in the housing market in terms of sales. So I do think it'll be interesting to see long term, what this actually is going to be, if we see kind of a resorting geographically of people being more willing and open to being a little further aflung. In my case, I spent a lot of time commuting, living in Natick and having an office in Amherst and one in Boston. There was it would be at least 12 hours a week spending commuting to some place or another. And I haven't commuted in 8 months, and it's awesome. And, I look forward to being in an office again with people, but I do think that I'm going to have to be more willing to work remotely in the future. So I think you may see some of that, but it's been incredible from my perch to see how much the housing market has not slowed. Cause I thought that was going to be I thought it was going to pop the balloon when when the pandemic started, and to see virtually no slowdown at all has been kind of incredible.
Another interesting aspect of things that I've seen when I've been out into the communities is broadband as an issue. And now that, there's so many people working remotely, plus the students remotely, the broadband is really being stressed. I know that downtown Brockton has a real issue with that. I talk to people that have to say, don't turn on the TV while we're on a Zoom call, because it really upsets the balance of who can be on equipment. So, and then there's an equity issue for, socioeconomic, but also for our aging population that might not be able to afford internet or might not have access to the media, an iPad or some type of a device. So it'll be interesting to explore that a little bit too.
Right. No, I think that's an excellent point. And again, ways in which the COVID crisis has exacerbated socioeconomic or social inequality. Part of it is geographic and regional. In our work, we do a lot of things looking at economic issues statewide. And so I've been surprised at the number of spots around Massachusetts that lack high-speed internet. There's large parts of Western Massachusetts only recently, and there's been initiatives to help increase that. So there's that in terms of remote working and its importance generally. But as you were noting about equipment and technology, kind of gets back a little bit to John's point before too, with the amount of remote learning, what equipment's available in the home for kids to be able to remote learn, parents being able to help and those kinds of things. And so, yeah, it's, you know, I'm a sociologist by training. And so these elements of social inequality are always very interesting to me, but it's, you know, it's disheartening when you see all the ways in which they kind of, the inequalities can perpetuate themselves in a crisis like this.
Well, we are like right on the dot at 1 o'clock. So thank you so much for the presentation. It was very interesting. We would love to talk to you about coming back after the first of the year to see, you know, how we're measuring up to the projections or what's going to happen. Every week is like a big surprise to us, I think. So thank you for being here. I wish that you hadn't said that the economy was running so, you know, consistently, because you might have had a little bit of a curse on what happened, but we'll forgive you for that, and definitely would love to speak more about this with you.
Yeah, happy to come back again, folks. All right, take care.
Thank you, Mark.
All right, bye-bye.
So John,
So
if
when-
you want to take a motion to adjourn, and then we'll keep the Zoom open for a few minutes if anyone wants to continue the conversation.
Yes,
I'll make the motion to adjourn.
we have a second from Bill. Thank you, everyone. I thought that was a great meeting. Look forward to the next one.
It
re-
was.
It really was exactly the aspects of what we're looking for, that data, right? To his point that we haven't seen it. OCPC, when COVID first hit, we did reach out to our communities and ask them what they needed. That was really more of a really pivoting back then, you know, needing technical assistance or how to run a Zoom meeting or borrowing the Zoom capacity. Those were different needs back in March versus where we are now. So we, you know, probably working with like a UMass, it wouldn't, you know, maybe another survey just to kind of get a temperature of really what's next to do. And obviously this is a topic that many of you had weighed in on with the surveys about the topics of conversation for the CEDs. So, you know, for everyone who was on it, thank you. I think I was blown away by the numbers and still trying to unpack in my mind, like some next steps of what we can do with it.
Well, one of the next steps that I can see is a community that we're working closely with on an EDA grant right now has to demonstrate these economic indicators, particularly of unemployment in the region, to support their application. So pretty much everything in there is going to be very helpful.
Great. Thank you.
I think that's it. Unless anybody else has anything to say? Great. And Becky, you're also a council delegate. What I'll be doing is sharing this presentation with the council, Oak Colony Planning Council delegates. So it really was informative.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Have a great day.